All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Definitely had a little concern that we might not be able to hold this because so many folks were without power and specifically internet connection, but I do sincerely appreciate all of you taking the time. And thankfully I can see some form of electricity in your background and glad that you're able to join us tonight. Why don't we just take a moment and go around the room for introductions. Suzanne Flowers, Transportation Planner for the City of Ann Arbor, and I will popcorn it over to Julie.
Hi, Julie Boland. I'm a member of the Ann Arbor Transportation Commission. I will, Raymond is next on my screen, so I'll popcorn it over to him.
All right, good evening, everyone. Raymond Hess, Transportation Manager for the city. Happy to have you all here tonight. And it looks like Brett is next on my screen.
All right, Brett Hadamaki, like Julie, a member of the Ann Arbor Transportation Commission. Let's go with Larry.
Yeah, Larry Deck with the Walk Bike Washtenaw, previously known as Washtenaw Bicycling and Walking Coalition, but it was too hard to say. Devin.
Hey, good evening, Devin Ackman, Equitable Engagement Steering Committee. I'll kick it over to Jonathan.
We can't hear you, Jonathan. It doesn't look like you're on mute, but.
If you're using a headset, I'm not sure if it's connected.
How about now?
There you go. You're good.
Okay. Jonathan Levine, I'm faculty in urban and regional planning at the University of Michigan, and I'll pop it over to Ken.
I'm Ken Anderson, and I work as a planner over at the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority. And I'll move it to Stacy.
Hi, everyone. Stacy Meekins with Sam Schwartz, and I'll pass it to Sid.
Hello, everyone. Sid, also with Sam Schwartz.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Raymond, if you would make Stacy a co-host, we can kind of kick things off.
I was made a panelist. Does that count?
I don't know if you can present as a panelist, but let's try.
Oh, okay, that worked.
Seems to be working. All right. We're just going to turn things over to Stacy to walk us through tonight's presentation. And Stacy, take it away.
All right. You guys are seeing like just the slide, right? Okay. Great. So thanks everyone for coming. I think I'm going to be tag teaming this a little bit with Suzanne and Raymond here tonight, but be walking through most of these slides. I think that we have gone through these enough that everybody's familiar. Raymond or Suzanne, anything you wanted to chime in with on these upfront slides? Okay, I see some head shaking here. So we'll just buzz right through these to the agenda. We have a lot of quick updates here. So I have a lot of items that I don't think will take long. Of course, if you have questions or comments, we can dwell on some of these longer. But a lot of them, like I said, are just some updates on what we've been up to. So we've done welcome and introductions. I wanted to spend the first amount of time going through safe systems update. And I believe that you guys got slides ahead of time. All right. Okay, I did add this slide today because I felt like I needed to frame out what we're talking about a little bit better. So hopefully a lot of this is a reminder, but what we've been working on with the city is one of the components that we've been working on is a safe systems review. And basically what that means is looking at how the city does transportation projects today, looking at the process and the practices and identifying what we could recommend to improve that process so that the city is more routinely implementing safety in all of its projects. So what that amounted to after talking with the staff, it turned out that maintenance of traffic really was an area that they felt they needed more guidance on. So that's about ensuring multimodal accommodation through construction. And then we also had another set of what we developed a memo for each of these. And so the second one was about routine improvements. And so that was about how do we integrate safety into all of our projects, even if it's just a resurfacing project, which historically had a scope of just repaving the road, putting back what was there. And I think had been incrementally shifting to include things like bike lanes or better crosswalk striping, but we thought it could be taken a little bit further. So we talked about that the last meeting or two about the checklist that we developed for the city to go through and help scope out what those projects could include. And then that third bucket is the project selection and programming. And that's what we started talking to you guys back in the summer about how to establish and weight the criteria that would lead to project selection. And then that has led us into an actual project selection that I'll go through in the next section about the action plan. So mostly I wanted to update you on the maintenance of traffic piece. And Sid, feel free to just chime in on any of these if you want to. So we developed a memo, framed it around several principles. And the first principle being that we need to ensure accessibility for people with disabilities. Again, all of this is like through the construction phase. So that includes things like maintaining accessible ramps. If the original ramp is being is part of the construction site or is being in any way obstructed, maintaining a clear space along the path. And it also gets into signals and auditory devices through the construction phase. I'll just pause there. Sid, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, no, this like, as Stacey said, we are pretty high level over here, but this basically captures the baseline that we want for construction sites to have as they are whenever they are using the public right of way, whenever they are impacting a sidewalk, whenever they are impacting a bike lane, whenever they're impacting any space that could be used by vulnerable road users, especially, we want to make sure that there are enough accommodations. Instead, whenever they block the sidewalk, so if they are rerouting people, they should ensure that it's all the reroutes are ADA compliant, and this is basically gets to maintaining some sort of at least 3 or 4 feet of clear space, and all these dimensions are included in the memo, but what you see over here is just captures the essence of what's in the memo.
Yes, good point. Thank you. And Raymond, I don't want to put you on the spot, but what we are developing for the city is this internal memo that then they would take and incorporate into the city's guiding document for transportation projects and practices. Anything else you wanted to say about that, Raymond?
Yeah, we call that the Orange Book, Stacy. It's kind of the standard specs that we use for construction activities in the right of way. So I did vet this with Nick Hutchinson, the city engineer, and he's supportive of it. It's something we've been trying to standardize for a while. Typically, the way that's been done in the past is we give like verbal updates, and we have like staff meetings, and we talk about best practices and the things everybody should be doing. But we think having a sort of formalized approach to it will be a little bit better for us. So and then I'll have a couple other comments, Stacy, when you get through, I think the 3 or 4 principles.
Okay.
On some of the other things we talked about.
Great. Yeah, so the second principle is about prioritizing protection for non-motorized users, and what that addresses is maintaining those bicycle and pedestrian paths or for vulnerable users, and then specifically ensuring the same level of comfort along those detours to the extent possible. And that means, like, if you have a protected bike lane, that the detour shouldn't be, you know, a shared lane on a really busy street. So it might mean that you need to have a longer detour for the bike route or a different detour for the bike route and the cars, so that you can maintain that same level of comfort. So people who are biking down, who had been biking down that protected bike lane and were used to a certain level of comfort, have that same level of comfort in the detour, and they're not kind of thrown into an unsafe situation. It also gets into guidance on the use of barriers and traffic control to protect bicycles and pedestrians in that temporary situation. So whether that's jersey barriers or other types of physical protection. And this is a graphic from another jurisdiction where it shows specifically, you know, just laying out for contractors, here's where you should have people park their vehicle. You should have them park in the travel lane if there are 2 lanes on that street, instead of what they might be doing just by intuitive nature would be to park as close to the curb as possible. Or by habit, I should say. And then shows how that would be marked off to guide the traffic around that construction vehicle. And then principle 3 is about making sure that any new dangers, conflicts that are created during the construction itself are eliminated or mitigated. So this is an example of this construction site impeded the visibility of the pedestrian signal. So it provides guidance on how to deal with those temporary situations to make sure that we're providing the right information to bicycles and pedestrians and well, all users, but particularly vulnerable users through the construction sites.
Yeah, and so if I could just add to that, another kind of thing we talk about in the memo is like maintaining clear sight lines. So this is also an example of that. Another guidance would be to make sure that no construction equipment is like parked more than like 20 feet within the crosswalk, so that there is clear sight lines maintained between vehicles and any pedestrians or people in wheelchairs, etc., using the crosswalk.
This is actually a slide from previously where we had developed the sample checklist for the routine improvements, but we're also working on a checklist for those construction sites or for the maintenance of traffic phase, so that the city has something to go off of and provide to a contractor to make sure that they're meeting all of those principles. Raymond, was this where you wanted to chime in?
Yeah, Stacy, I think, again, I spoke to Nick about this and a couple things that we talked about. First of all, we think in as much as this should apply to public city sponsored projects, we actually have observed a lot of discrepancies on the private development side, whereby, you know, a new building is going in, or, you know, maybe a utility company is working in the right of way. And so I then spoke to my counterpart who oversees private development, Amy Ponsock, and we talked about kind of the considerations. A couple things to note that she wanted me to bring to your attention, or that we discussed. The first is there might be some consideration or nuance about the specific geography of an area or the context of an area. You know, the downtown, which is a pretty good grid and offers more opportunities for detours, you know, for all modes of transportation. is a different kind of opportunity than, more of the outskirts of downtown or suburban style development, which might be different than like neighborhood streets. So, for example, in private development, you might have a downtown development where, we may try to get them to put in scaffolding. So then that way, if they're working on the building overhead, the pedestrians can still, walk underneath in scaffolding. And we do have some examples where that's been done in the past in downtown Ann Arbor. And then there are other construction sites where that wasn't done. However, when you think about like, the street that I live on, right, it's, 30 feet across. And if there's work happening and a driveway that's spilling over to the sidewalk, the question becomes, would you really do a series of, kind of downtown style, scaffolding wouldn't be appropriate, but like Jersey barriers protected from the traffic. So really just kind of thinking through the context and the application might be worth kind of thinking through a little bit. The other thing that Amy said is our most egregious offenses tend to be very short-term construction projects. So when there is a long-term construction project and it's anticipated that a sidewalk or bike lane will be closed for quite some time, we can forecast that and we can try to accommodate it. However, if there's short-term construction that's happening, I'll give you a good example. Last week or the week before, DTE was upgrading gas main, I believe, along 7th Street, kind of just south of Pauline. I saw it when I was taking the bus home, and if you've seen that work around town, they tear up the sidewalk, right? Because that's kind of close to where the gas main is, or maybe it's even under the sidewalk. So they close the sidewalk down. And then on 7th Street, the question would be, well, where should we detour the pedestrians to? Using the example that Stacy showed, we should, make an accommodation with a ramp onto the roadway and protect, the pedestrians from the vehicles that are traversing that road. But then there's also a bike lane there up against the curb. So now you are impacting the bicycle lane. And so then if you shift that over, then there's no longer a southbound vehicular travel lane, which then requires a fairly extensive detour. But Amy's point is, a lot of times the way DT does that work, and I'm not picking on DT, I'm just using it as an example, they do that work for like a day or two, and then they just march up the street and kind of like cold patch it, which is, maybe another issue, but they try to do some temporary restoration to the site before they move up to the next block and so forth and so on. So, if you think about maintenance of traffic and sort of, signage and press releases and things like that, that would typically go into a major scale development or major detour, the question might be, does that make sense if it's just for a day or 2 days? And I don't know the answer, but I think it's something worth mentioning in that space. And then the third thing that I wanted to mention, Amy didn't bring this up, but it is something I would like you all to be aware of, is we have 2 inspectors that constantly go around the city looking for, I think Sid was reviewing the slide where the pedestrian signal was blocked by construction fencing. Principle 3. We try to shut those down as much as possible, but with just 2 inspectors that inspect construction activities, especially for private development, it's hard to catch everything. And it's, quite frankly, is a little bit of a game of cat and mouse. Whenever we hear a complaint, we do rely on things like A2 Fix It to bring some of these issues to our attention. And then as soon as we find out about them, we try to rectify them as soon as possible. But there's a certain bit of, like I said, cat and mouse that's played. We would never knowingly approve like this configuration, but it just maybe happens because the contractor goes out and does it. Again, that doesn't make it right, but it's just one of those situations about whether we know something like that is happening or not. And our ability to rectify it in a timely manner is somewhat a function of capacity. So I think putting this all down on paper though is important, because in that way, when contractors come in either for private development or contractors for public projects, we can point them to resources that say thou shall or thou shalt not do the following, based on your construction activities. So So I just wanted to kind of throw out there that there might be some nuance, there might be some kind of special considerations for special circumstances, either by context or duration or anything like that, that we are still kind of thinking through internally. And so I'm starting to socialize some of this with my colleagues here at the city. Devin.
Yeah, thank you for that, Raymond. It makes a lot of sense. Location, duration, all those kinds of factors. I guess I have a question, and maybe we can pick on DTE because it's that week. So good choice. But I live in that area. I'm a runner. I'm a bicyclist. I've had many interactions with those kind of, specifically this one, but other locations like that. And the problem is, they get in there to do business, right? So I guess my question where I'm going with this is what can be done also to enforce. I mean, it's always come down to enforcement with a lot of these things, right? So how can we ensure, like, once these measures are put in place, that they actually happen? I mean, we don't have the bandwidth, right, to go around and basically constantly, as you just alluded to, have eyes on that. But is there a process of sticks and carrots with some of these contractors too?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe this is a note for Suzanne and Stacy and Sid. Maybe we should also reevaluate the penalties and fees, or even permit fees. I can't quite recall the specifics, but I seem to recall that a sidewalk closure is cheaper than like a lane closure, and so it's a path of least resistance, both literally and figuratively, for developers. And so maybe if we do things on par, that might be something for us to kind of bring the carrots and sticks to the table, so that people understand that the impact to any user of the roadway, especially vulnerable road users, is just as impactful as others. I think, on the front end, what we can try to do is try to catch as much of this stuff in permitting as much as possible, and make people, abide by, our standard specifications. But, to a certain extent, for those that are going to flagrantly ignore or break those rules, it is a question of whether we catch them in the act, and that can be difficult sometimes. And that's why we sometimes often rely on, our residents to help us point those out through things like A2 Fix-It. So it's by no means a perfect system with the bandwidth we have, but I think it is, there's definitely room for improvement. So I think you bring up a good point about maybe reevaluating those carrots and sticks.
Yeah, I just want to, sorry, go ahead, Sid.
Oh, if I could just add, a lot of times, like, enforcement is key to the success of something like this. But when we are talking to these people on on sites, sometimes they don't even think about this. Like, this is not in their mind as much. It's not that they are like actively trying to make it difficult for others. It's just that they have never been that person. So it's not something on their mind. So it is also a little bit about awareness and then enforcement. So it's a little bit about just bringing this up, talking with the contractors, and giving them, kind of making them sensitive to kind of what the impacts of the things that they're doing are. So of course, enforcement needs to be there, but we can try another step first.
I was going to say something similar. I think that, but I'll add a leg to this three-legged stool. So I think it's awareness. I think contractors don't necessarily want to do something that's unsafe. So I think that's part of it. I think it's compliance, and that's the permitting part. If we can create this checklist that is tied to the permit itself, so that they can just be compliant, and then enforcement is like stick part, right? So if we are improving each of those, we might still not end up somewhere perfect, but we end up in an improved position. Brett, I think I saw you had a hand up.
Yeah, I think we mostly covered it. I just think on the upfront side, we talked about the permitting, having something that's written that we can include in the permitting process, but also in the contracting, in the seeking bids, and then actually signing contract, with city projects, that's something, another place that this could appear. The permitting would only apply maybe to private projects or utilities, but with city projects, it could also maybe be part of the contracting effort up front.
Yeah, that's great. And I like the idea of checking on the penalties, Raymond, so we can do that. All right, so I didn't have a slide on it, but we do have a section in the memo that touches on implementation, and we've gotten at some of that here tonight. And I think we have a little bit more that we can dig into based on this conversation. Any other thoughts or questions about the MOT, the maintenance of traffic stuff? All right. So I didn't put a slide in here reminding you all of the criteria that we had vetted through you all. I remember back in August or so, we asked you about different weights of equity and building out the bike network versus safety. And so we had developed a matrix of scoring all of the projects that were in Moving Together. So these are basically the steps we went through to get to that list that I think I showed you in the fall of where the prioritized projects landed. But we really started this back in the Moving Together planning phase by doing the crash analysis, surveying the public about where they wanted to see different kinds of improvements. So that was that first phase. And then we compiled all of those corridor projects, and with your help, prioritized all of those projects based on those criteria that I just rattled off, but also some practical considerations like, is there a project coming up? Is there pavement maintenance that is going to be necessary that would make this a good opportunity? Is it a connection that would tie into a bikeway at one or both ends of the segment? So with all of that, we did this preliminary scoring, or we prioritized the projects. Then we went through that list and looked at a preliminary scope of what a project could be. And that process involved also looking at the current CIP and what's already programmed, and then recommended where our list of projects fall within either the existing CIP or if it's a new project. And then as a final step, we looked at what does that get us at the end of the day? How are we doing in terms of the metrics set forth in Moving Together? So, oh, I do have it, just wasn't on the right slide. So these are the weights that we'd come up with for the different types of improvements and what we called priority elements versus opportunity elements. And then this is on the right, those are the resulting corridors that rose to the top, basically the top 20%, I think, of the entire list of projects. So then what we did was, as I mentioned, we looked at the current CIP. We found that some projects fit well within the scope of what was in the CIP in terms of like where the project was being done. And then there were another 4 projects that were close and maybe just needed a modification to the CIP, either in terms of what the extent of the project that was being considered, or in 1 or 2 cases, it was that the project was scoped for further out, and it was falling on our priority list, so we were recommending moving it up in time in the CIP. And so what that means is that anything that was in the CIP or was just a minor modification to a CIP, we think that can fall into those can move forward, and the project scoping guide checklist that we developed can help ensure that the safety projects are incorporated into that scope, and that project and maybe it expands in scope from what it is now, but it checks all the safety boxes that we're looking for. And then the remaining, there were another 16 corridors that didn't fall in the CIP. And so we looked at all of those and identified some major and/or minor capital improvements. In most cases, we came up with recommendations for both categories, minor and major, to give the city some guidance on how to scope that moving forward and get that into future CIPs. So I have this broken out by those categories here. So I know you guys have these slides. If they're too hard to read on my screen, these are the projects that fell in the current CIP. And we don't have to go through them one by one unless you guys have any questions about them. These are the projects that we thought required a modification to the CIP. And then there's, it was more than one or two. We had 4 here that we're suggesting they just advance more quickly. And then there were 2 that we thought might need a little bit different extents or different scope.
What is the term, excuse me, improvements refer to? Like Getty's Avenue improvements, State Street improvements, etc.
It's not in, it is basically a synonym for scope in this case. So I think we can revise that terminology. We are not suggesting what specifically should happen there, but that scope of this project, which currently goes from Washtenaw to Huron, be extended.
So I'm trying to understand what kinds of projects are we discussing here? So
this checklist would, I don't have the whole checklist on the screen here, but it would basically a good guide would be the speed management toolbox that we have on the speed management website. But it's more than that, I think, in some cases. So lane narrowing, pedestrian safety islands, curb bump outs, bike lane striping, or a buffer. It's basically like looking at the whole toolbox of safety improvements that could be incorporated into that project.
Stacy, I'm interpreting Jonathan's question. Maybe Jonathan, are you asking about like the route project, what that project calls for? Or are you asking about what the recommendation from Stacy is above and beyond what's already identified in the CIP?
I was responding to the term improvement, so I just didn't, I thought maybe we could be more specific about what we mean by improvements. Improvements are quite vague. They could be everything in transportation parlance, from a road widening to adding a pedestrian refuge island to bumping out to slow the traffic.
Yeah, no, your point is well taken. I think improvements is overused in this industry, and I think we could change that terminology. But we're also not trying to pinpoint exactly what happens at each intersection in this part of in this exercise, because that needs to be more further engineered and vetted by Raymond's team or the rest of the city staff. Does that make sense? Okay. Brett.
Yeah, so this is is this really just a CIP centric, or does
This is taking the list of projects that that basically resulted in this map and trying to fit it into the CIP.
okay?
And not necessarily like trying to see how it relates to the CIP now, but then also if it's not relating to the CIP, do we just need to change the CIP, or are we suggesting new projects be added?
Okay, so a wide net was cast. It wasn't just looking at what's in the CIP and evaluating. Okay, because yeah, okay, all right, thanks.
Yeah, and we didn't even start with the CIP. We started with, here's the list of things that we think should happen. Are things already happening there that we can take advantage of?
Okay.
So the list, the full list is displayed on the map of the corridors that we were focused on. And we did look at the CIP and what specifically was recommended or what was being scoped. I mean, there aren't a lot of specifics in that document, but we did vet, is this intensive enough of a project to address what we think needs to happen here? And if it wasn't, then we added that detail. And so I think in most cases it was, once you factor in that checklist that we're recommending the staff go through. And then anything that wasn't included on those previous two lists, we looked at afresh. And what we looked at were, are there high crash locations here? Is it either a corridor or an intersection that was a tier 1, tier 2? What was the nature of those crashes? We looked at, were there quick build opportunities that we could be taking advantage of? Were there sidewalk gaps? Were there requests for crosswalk enhancements, bike route recommendations, and the intersections for biking that needed improvement that we had called out and moving together? So we looked at all of those different data sets as we were evaluating each of these corridors to come up with our recommendations of the types of projects that we think could happen on that street. And again, everything still needs to be further engineered and vetted. So this is why I call it preliminary scoping. It's what we think could happen along these streets to address what we're seeing and the opportunities that we're seeing and the issues that we're seeing. So I don't have that detail on a slide. It was just too much detail to go through. But I believe that those draft memorandums will be posted on the website. Is that right, Raymond and or Suzanne?
Yep, all the final materials will be on the website once they're all finalized. Sorry, Jonathan, your hand is up.
Yes, could you please go back to the map?
Yes.
I want to ask about West Jackson, which is not on this list. The reason why I asked was three reasons why I asked. One was the pedestrian crash with a critical injury. I hope the guy survived on West Jackson. The second is that it's a very long stretch. I think it's about 3/4 of a mile from the split with Dexter to Maple without a safe crossing. So we have people getting off the bus, for example, and needing to cross. And if they actually were to go for a safe crossing, they could add about 3/4 of a mile to their journey, which clearly they don't. That's not how pedestrians operate. I do know that it's an MDOT route. I have read that MDOT has given the green light or some manner of green light for pedestrian crossings there, and I wonder if we can get an update.
Yeah, Jonathan, thanks for the question. And it is an important corridor. It's one we've been working on for a while. Gosh, Eli Cooper's been working on this one for probably close to 10 years. A little bit of history, as I understand it, again, it predates my time, is when Jackson was road dieted, which was maybe in like 2014, the understanding was that crossings would be reevaluated about a year after that road diet, because first MDOT wanted to make sure the road diet was working, and then once they determined it did, they were supposed to come back and reevaluate crosswalks. That never happened. It was something we insisted upon for year over year over year. And again, Eli, if you all know Eli, he's he's tenacious in a good way. So he pestered MDOT. And so this late last year, we finally did get some agreement in concept to adding 4 new crosswalks along the Huron-Jackson corridor. And where it's at right now is MDOT said, well, we conceptually agree to the concept. However, we need a set of design plans from the city before we sign off on it in totality. And by the way, MDOT's not going to contribute to those improvements. So the city is on the hook for that. So what we've identified is using the American Rescue Plan Act funding, ARPA, for these improvements, because it's already on a state corridor. So, using federal funds on a state corridor already, there's a nexus there in terms of the amount of approvals we have to go through. And then I just got, I think it was last week or the week, maybe 10 days or so ago, approval to use ARPA funds for the design of the project, since it's not on a city corridor, it's on a state corridor, because the people who are managing the ARPA funds wanted to be really sure we weren't breaking any rules by using our money on a state facility. So we just got the green light like last week or 10 days or so ago. So it is moving forward. We're going to actually we're going to try to fast track it. The hope is to actually install those this year. Don't hold me to that, because there are several approvals that are going to be outside of our control, but we're going to use an outside contractor to help us with or an outside consultant to help with the design. And the locations are, I was just trying to quickly find it, but I know at Vets Park is one. Let's see.
At the ice rink, is that what you mean by Vets Park?
Yes, yeah. Here it is. So yes, Jackson Ave at Veterans Park, Jackson Ave near Warden, Jackson Ave near Virginia, and then on Huron, somewhere between Crest and Urbana are the 4 locations that we're looking at. So the idea that we have is that we would design these to be rectangular rapid flashing beacons, so the yellow signs with the flashy lights. We feel like, given the character of the corridor, we feel like a higher order improvement is needed. So we're teeing up the design as we speak, and we set aside funding with ARPA to implement, and we're going to hopefully kind of march it forward with MDOT. So
is it going to include refuge islands?
Probably not. The configuration and the width of Main Street, I think, or I'm sorry, Jackson. I don't know if we've looked at whether islands, well, I don't know. I'd have to check, because with if there is a center turn lane, there might be an opportunity. But if there isn't, we don't want to steal from the bike lane in order to put in the pedestrian refuge island. So the higher order rectangular rapid flashing beacon will at least draw higher attention to motorists as pedestrians are trying to cross.
So you'll let us know about the potential for refuge islands?
Yeah, let me just quickly look.
There is a turn lane at both Vets Park and Warden. Right,
but we can't block the turn lane is serving as a turn lane too, right? So if the turn lane is actually serving an entryway, if it's a true mid block, it's easier to kind of get the refuge island in. But if it's at an entryway, it's more difficult for us to squeeze in one of those pedestrian. But I think that'll be part of the design. Admittedly,
Yeah.
I'm kind of speaking out of my expertise here in terms of having not looked at the specifics and what the potential is among the engineers. That's something that we can definitely look at. So yeah, we can circle back once we have those designs.
All right, so I mentioned at the beginning, the end of our process was to look at how we did after selecting corridors and identifying what would be feasible along those corridors or appropriate. We're not designing them specifically, so I'm not able to say we're achieving 10 curb extensions and 20 refuge islands, but this is how this is what we were able to kind of quantify or at least tie to the metrics from moving together. So in all of those projects that we've looked at, we're covering all tier 1 corridors with the exception of Washtenaw. That was on purpose because we felt that MDOT coordination would take longer and not be a near-term corridor. And then over half of the tier 1 intersections are included along those corridors. Half of the tier 2 corridors are included, and several tier 2 intersections. So that's just for that one strategy of addressing the high crash locations. And then I do think there are a number of opportunities for curb extensions and centerline hardening, which we had called out specifically in addressing to address dangerous behaviors. I don't know that I want to read all of these specifically, but I did want to point out that the one thing that was easily quantifiable were the bike routes. So there are recommendations among these corridors that would exceed 25 miles of new or upgraded bikeways, which would achieve that metric of 5 miles per year if these near-term improvements were able to be installed in 5 years. So any questions on all of that?
The language in the plan refers to all ages and abilities bikeways. Could we include that here?
Yeah, well, I think we can, since it's not fully designed, I don't know that I can go so far as to say that it would achieve an all ages and abilities design. But I can look back and see if we do have enough.
I mean, all ages and abilities is not a single design. It's a design that meets a certain standard given its environment. But I think it behooves us to take the language of the plan and make sure that it comes into our scope to express to the designers that the goal of the plan is in fact these all ages and abilities bike routes.
Yes. Yeah, no, agreed. And I think in the scoping language, we do carry that over. And we were just a little bit more vague in these achievements because we're not designing the whole thing right now. It's a preliminary scope. But I take your point. I think we want to be consistent as much as possible and include that the goals up front and visible. Any other questions or thoughts?
And I'm sorry, I just wanted to circle back to the recommendation Jonathan made about Jackson. I was misremembering that center turn lane runs most of the length of Jackson up to at least Virginia, from Virginia to the Stadium Maple intersection. So I think there are probably some very good opportunities for a pedestrian refuge island. I was just misremembering that center turn lane ran that long.
Seems like it might be worthwhile to make some small adjustments east or west in order to be able to put in a refuge island.
Devin?
Yeah, thanks. Quick question. I know this is pretty early to ask this question, but will the supplemental action money, the 3.8 million, impact any of these projects here, or do we not know that yet since it's so early?
Yeah, I'll take this one. It's too early.
So
we, the full request that we put forward was around $22 million. And so through a lot of interactions back and forth, they kind of chipped down what we were really, really hoping to achieve. The two main items that they had selected were around speed management in general and quick build. And so we just want to make sure that we have a very thorough understanding based on our proposal that was submitted of what they're willing to fund with that 3.8 million and what they were not interested, because there's some questions that we have. So we are just starting to dig into that process, but we are nowhere, I have not, Raymond or myself have had any of those conversations with USDOT via Federal Highway Administration yet.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. And one other quick question just on that thread, and this is a different funding kind of question, but I guess it can kind of tie in with quick builds. Have we ever looked at Bloomberg Philanthropies Asphalt Art Initiative as a city?
Yeah, I looked at that. I think Raymond had kind of the first couple months, maybe first 6-8 months that I was on staff. We had looked at that. I don't remember why we had not. I think that there was some kind of a mismatch.
Okay.
I'm not saying that we wouldn't continue to look at those things in the future. That's definitely something on my purview. But also wanting to make sure that we deliver on the funding sources that have been allocated to our team and make sure that we are responsible with that.
Okay, thank you.
At the risk of being a little obstinate, I want to circle back to the bike route issue. All ages and abilities is not a design. All ages and abilities is a policy. It was a policy adopted by the council of the City Council of Ann Arbor. And I think it's important to say, where we talk about these bike improvements at each location, we say, and we are going to endeavor to fill that policy, obviously with designs that would be would vary by location and by the nature of the traffic on that road. But that's inherent in the policy language of all ages and abilities bike routes.
Yeah, I'm not trying to disagree, Jonathan. I'm just trying to suggest that it is incumbent on the design to get you to that level of comfort. And so in some cases, I just don't want to promise and overpromise for the city that if you need a raised sidewalk level bike lane on that particular corridor to make it all ages and abilities, but what you can do in 5 years is a striped bike lane, then I don't want to put in here that we are necessarily achieving 25 miles of all ages and abilities, but I think it is fair point that that should be the goal, and that is what we are working towards. And
that's our job as public servants working for democratically elected representatives. I think it's important that we understand that.
Well, I think we do, Jonathan. I think the point is well taken. I think we can definitely add some language that reflects, the all ages and abilities. I mean, we endeavor to do that on every project, right? The devil's in the details. So we come at it from that approach of, making things all ages and abilities. So yeah, I don't have any real heartburn about trying to, move in that direction. Yeah.
okay, Suzanne, was this a slide you wanted to take?
Sure. I just wanted to let everyone know that the survey will be closed for the speed management kind of input process. I'm calling this kind of an early phase in development of our frequently asked questions. And I had copied those for all of you, mainly just to let you know the kind of breadth of information that was collected. We're just finalizing the FAQs that have really been developed to address many of the key topics that came out of that, one being enforcement. That was a routine theme. Red light cameras was another one. It is very vague in the state of Michigan, but what is clear is that we're not doing it right now. And so we just wanted to pull some of those major themes out. I had given Stacy comments back at probably mid last week. And so I think that there were just a couple tweaks we wanted to make, and then we will go ahead and be posting those FAQs within the next week or two. That way people can see how their comments are showing up as part of that speed management program. So I just wanted to take a moment and see if there was anything that was either surprising or that we want to make sure that we call out. I'll bring, obviously all of that information will be on the website, and we can post comments if we want, if people are really curious about that. I have no issue with that. The full list of all of the comments are not going to populate on the FAQs, but we can just add that as like a PDF attachment for people to see what their comments were. So if there was anything in there that really stood out to anyone, I just want to give a moment to have anyone say anything about that. Julie.
Yeah, I read through them with interest and thanks for providing those. Some of them were a bit confusing, both that they confused me and the person seemed confused. And I wondered what prompt they were responding to.
Well, the prompts were on the survey, if I'm not mistaken. I am pulling that up. Give me one moment. And the
I think
questions
the
were
headings were
pretty
just like question
simplistic.
and comment. Yeah.
Give me just, so the questions were, there were two. What questions do you have? Just in general. And then, would you like to share comments? We just really wanted to leave it very, very, very broad. Now, obviously, this was on the speed management story map. It was at the very end with the desire to have people walk through the speed management program. There were I felt very targeted questions about enforcement, speeding in general. How can we get these things? How can we get this stuff implemented quickly? And then there was some more nuanced information that the Sam Schwartz team really dug into, like our enforcement policies, what state limitations we have in terms of really like red light cameras. I get that question probably once a week. And so those were just the two prompts that people were responding to.
Thanks.
Generally, I thought there was a lot of positive support generally about speeding being an issue in our community and how we want to address that. Now, as Raymond has said, the devil will be in the details when we maybe pilot some of these or actually start digging into the nuance of implementation. Then there may be a different story, but we're really trying to be conscientious of getting this information to people, getting social media out, getting next door messages, utilization of community-wide announcements so that people know about this information, this program that is being developed. It is not done. Okay, and unless there are any other questions, that's all I had to say about the speed management FAQs.
All right, I'm gonna stop sharing and try to switch out what I'm sharing. The annual snapshot is not live yet, so I have a behind the scenes look at the status. And Suzanne, feel free to jump in on any of this if you have anything to add. I know that you all have seen this in an earlier iteration, so I don't think there's anything too surprising here, but the annual snapshot will hopefully be very user-friendly and engaging, gives a little bit of background on moving together, and then an overview of crash trends. We're actually working with Suzanne right now there are a number of different ways to show the crash data. So we're working on which is the best way to show it. This is actually in response to some comments we heard from you all at a previous meeting about showing specifically number of people biking and walking who were involved in these crashes. So a couple of statistics there. And then it also links to the traffic crashes dashboard, which has more graphs and more data and stats. Wherever possible, we do want to link to what other sites the city has good information instead of trying to replicate it here. So the 2022 achievements focus on these different buckets, the systemic changes that include the speed management program, a new way of delivering projects in the quick build program, and the safe systems process changes that we went through earlier tonight. And then safety enhancements. So these are like the physical locations that had some capital improvement investments. And then an overview of policies that will ultimately make the streets in Ann Arbor safer. So then this goes into, that's just an overview up here, and then this goes into those in more detail as we scroll through. So we have, some of these are more visual than others. So we tried to make even the boring stuff a little bit more digestible with an overview of what the program or what's happening today and what this change means for Ann Arbor. And then this is will be the more visual part where we can have some maps or graphics in the background as you scroll through some of the projects that were done.
And as Stacy is scrolling through that, taking photos and getting real life images have been very problematic the last 2 weeks, as many of you well know. I had a whole day scheduled today to go and get some photos, and then it started raining. So I'm just waiting for a little bit of break in the weather to be able to get some nice photos like we have in front of us to show the improvements that are being made. And then we're also waiting for all of our project managers to provide all of their updates to Ethan Miller, our GIS expert, so that we can populate all of the maps that we intend to have, just showing the locations of improvements.
Yeah, so I guess we still have quite a few placeholders on here, but this is, like I said, a behind the scenes look of in progress. And I think that while it looks like quite a few gaps, they're easy gaps to fill. So I think that we'll be able to pull this together in the near future. So an overview of community engagement that has been done in throughout the last year. And then we are still working with Ann Arbor on what we can visually show here. And hopefully that we'll have some more specifics to include in the what's upcoming in 2023 section.
They'll just say that there are a lot of already existing data sources, like our citywide map that shows upcoming construction projects, utility projects, Hazer ratings. That information is updated routinely. And even some of the other kind of outreach and encouragement programming, like Bike to Work Day, you know, meet with a planner, you know, have coffee with a planner sort of thing. Like, these are some of the things that we want to make sure that we're populating, that we're get images, short videos, and we do a much better job of storytelling, so we can really show and highlight all of the good work that happens across the city. And it takes many, many people such as yourselves to make these things happen. And so a year in, I am still trying to get a lot of photos. It just does take a little bit of time, but we are really out there trying to populate this. And the goal is to have this launch in March.
Any questions or feedback?
Yeah, I have a question. I submitted to you some suggestions on how to report the annual accomplishments in a table format that would make it clear how much progress was being made against the goals. But it would show it both on a yearly basis and on a cumulative basis. I wonder if you'd had a chance to look at those suggestions.
Yeah, so the snapshot is not meant to capture every strategy and everything that we're doing. That is something that we will be compiling ourselves. But this is just more of like, what are some of the highlights that we really want to show? There's no reason why we can't do that internally, but I think it could be, there's over like 50 strategies just in the transportation plan. So I feel like this is a more appropriate way to demonstrate that. And Larry, I think the other piece of that is we may not report the same thing every year. It may have a slightly different flavor based on the type of work. You know, maybe there's a 1 or 2 year period that's really, really heavily, you know, bike influenced or sidewalk influenced. And so we just want to be able to reflect some of that, but it doesn't mean that we're not tracking that internally, because we are. And that's why we have all of our project managers provide that information to our GIS experts so that we can pull those numbers. So if you do ask me that, I'll be able to email Ethan and say, hey, can you pull up the GIS data? What was it last year? What was it this year? And be able to pull all that into a table very easily.
You know, I think I can see that what you want to report might vary each year, but it seems like there are a lot of hard numbers in the plan. It'd be good to see how we're progressing against that, and be good to have that in an ongoing format to see, are we really meeting the goals or not? So I guess I would encourage doing that in a visible way, and it'd be very concise, but it would carry a lot of information.
Thanks, Larry. Yeah, and we actually do have that set up in an Excel spreadsheet for the city to have at their disposal. Anything else on that? I think our next item was just a call for April items. There's nothing else on the snapshot.
So I will just say that our next meeting won't be until the end of April, just as a reminder. And Sam Schwartz will probably be finished up. So this may indeed be the last time that you all see Sid and Stacy on camera. We're looking to finish up their contract, believe it or not, in March, which is starting this week.
I'd like to propose an item for April. It has to do with quick build. So we heard a few meetings ago, we heard analysis of the vertical plastic beacons that are they're not beacons, the vertical plastic signs that are in crosswalks, in or adjacent to crosswalks, that they were assessed as being highly effective in improving the stopping rate. And we talked about if this is highly effective and it's presumably cheap, I got to assume that a bit of plastic is among the cheaper things we do. Could this not be spread? Could it not be maybe even the norm, except in locations where it doesn't, where for some reason it doesn't fit, if we're talking about unsignalized crosswalks? I'd be interested in learning about the possibility for those to be more broadly used, since we know that they are quite effective.
Yeah, Jonathan, that's a good suggestion. Maybe what we can do at that meeting, Suzanne, is talk about our crosswalk design guidelines, because that's, there's sort of this analysis that we perform that kind of helps us identify the magnitude of improvements kind of based on that context. So, for example, if you think about like neighborhood streets, maybe we don't need those are called R1-6s. So that's the MUTCD, the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. That's the code number for it. It's the in-road pedestrian crosswalk signs. So, on neighborhood streets that might require a different level of improvement versus what would be on a collector versus what would be on an arterial versus what would be on a multi-lane arterial. But I think it'd be great to walk that through and kind of show you all, what that decision tree looks like, and how we apply those kind of different elements. And when we scale things up to, those in-road signs versus the yellow flashy signs versus overhead and all that. So that could be a good thing to.
And specifically, if we could talk about the possibility of revising the standards to make much more broad the use of these devices. So one thing is the standards that we currently have, but then is there any potential for expand? I mean, I was in a crosswalk and I literally had to jump out of the way of a speeding car in order to save my life. I've got some candidates, and I really wonder why these effective improvements aren't present.
Yeah, I think it's a good suggestion. We'll talk about it at that meeting.
Any other potential topics? I know the one thing we will dedicate some time to is kind of our next steps as a subcommittee, and what our group of really like to move forward. I've been keeping notes over the last several months on some of those topics, so I'll be pulling together an agenda and sharing that with all of you beforehand. Anything else? We didn't do a question and answer. We don't have any of the members of the public attending tonight, separate from the people who are panelists. But if there were separate questions or topics of conversation, we have about 10 minutes that we could address those as well. Well, I have no questions. I would just like to take a moment to thank Stacy and all of the very hard work and dedication that her team and all the sub-consultants such as Sid and many others who are not here tonight have participated to make our Vision Zero implementation plan really come together, and for really being kind to me as I was just getting on board. This contract was really getting rolled out, so thank you.
You guys are in good hands with Suzanne. We'll be watching you closely. I have nothing but the highest of hopes for Ann Arbor safety in Ann Arbor. You guys have a good team on your hands.
Now Google recommends me MLive articles.
Yeah.
Like, so we saw you get the Safe Streets for All grant, and we were just like sharing the articles within the office.
Great. Well, if there is nothing else, I'm giving a 5-second countdown. All right, 3 seconds. All right. Well, thank you everyone for participating this evening. We really do appreciate your time, and have a great rest of your evening. Thank you.
Hey, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe out there.